Which feels riskier to you, driving on the highway or flying on an airplane? Many people immediately say flying. Plane crashes are dramatic, frightening, and highly memorable. Yet statistically speaking, commercial air travel is remarkably safe, and driving is, well, considerably more dangerous. This example illustrates one of the central ideas in the psychology of risk. The risks that feel most dangerous are not always the risks that are objectively most dangerous. Beginning in the 1970s, psychologists such as Paul Slovic, Baruch Fischhoff, and Sarah Lichtenstein began systematically studying why public perceptions of danger often differ from statistical estimates of risk. In a series of studies, they asked people to evaluate dozens of hazards, including nuclear power, pesticides, commercial aviation, handguns, and smoking. Their goal was to understand why different hazards evoke different perceptions of risk, and to identify the psychological characteristics that make some hazards feel more dangerous than others. This line of work became known as the psychometric approach to risk perception. One of its central findings is that people do not evaluate risks solely on the basis of probability and expected harm. Instead, risk judgments are shaped by a number of psychological characteristics that influence how dangerous a hazard feels. To understand these findings, we first need to distinguish between two different kinds of risk. Psychologists often distinguish between objective risk and subjective risk. Objective risk refers to the actual probability of harm. It is the kind of risk that can be estimated using data, statistics, and evidence. For example, researchers can estimate the likelihood of being injured in an automobile accident or developing a particular kind of disease. Objective risk is really asking a straightforward question. How likely is this outcome? Subjective risk, on the other hand, refers to how dangerous something feels. It's the psychological experience of risk. When you think to yourself, that sounds scary, or I don't feel safe doing that, you're responding to subjective risk. Sometimes objective risk and subjective risk line up fairly well. A generally dangerous situation, such as standing near the edge of a steep cliff, often feels dangerous. But often, these two types of risk do not line up. Many people feel more anxious about flying than driving, even though commercial air travel is statistically very safe. At the same time, most of us think very little about driving because it's familiar and part of everyday life, even though it poses a much greater objective risk. Importantly, subjective risk is not simply a mistake or a failure to understand statistics. Research on risk perception suggests that people respond not only to probabilities and expected outcomes, but also to the psychological meaning of hazards. As a result, people often consider factors such as whether they feel a risk is familiar or unfamiliar, the degree of control they feel they have over it, the potential for a catastrophic consequences, how easily they can imagine it occurring, and whether the activity provides important benefits. These characteristics can be useful cues, but they can also lead subjective risk to diverge from objective risk. One of the most robust findings in risk perception research is that familiarity influences how dangerous a hazard feels. Risks that people encounter regularly often seem easier to understand and manage than risks that are unfamiliar. Think about your daily routine. Most of us get into a car without giving it much thought. Driving seems ordinary because we've done it thousands of times. Now imagine being asked to ride in a fully autonomous vehicle. No steering wheel, no pedals, no person. Even if evidence suggests that the technology is at least as safe as human drivers, many people would still feel uneasy. Would you? The objective risk might be the same or even lower, but the subjective experience can be quite different. Research suggests that unfamiliar risks often evoke greater concern because they're accompanied by greater uncertainty. Importantly, familiarity does not change the actual probability of harm, but it does change how a risk feels. Another psychological characteristic that influences risk perception is perceived control. Research suggests that people are generally more comfortable accepting risks that they believe they can influence. Driving illustrates this pattern well. Although it carries substantial risk, many people feel safer behind the wheel because they believe they can avoid danger through their own actions. Commercial air travel illustrates the opposite pattern. When we board an airplane, we become passengers. Our safety depends on the decisions and actions of pilots, mechanics, and air traffic controllers. A perceived lack of control is often associated with greater concern about a risk, even when objective probabilities suggest otherwise. Risk perception research has also shown that people tend to respond differently to voluntary and involuntary risks. In the studies conducted by Slovic, Fischhoff, and Lichtenstein, hazards that were perceived as imposed on people rather than freely chosen were often judged to be less acceptable and in many cases more risky. Many individuals willingly participate in activities such as skiing, mountain climbing, or riding motorcycles, despite understanding that these activities involve genuine danger. At the same time, these same individuals might react strongly to risks such as environmental pollution, exposure to hazardous chemicals, or contaminated drinking water. One explanation for this difference is that voluntarily accepted risks often come with a sense of personal choice, and sometimes a greater feeling of control. Involuntary risks, by contrast, may feel imposed, unavoidable, or even unfair. As a result, people often evaluate the same level of objective risk differently depending on whether they believe they chose to accept the risk or had it imposed upon them. The probability of harm may be similar, but the psychological meaning of the risk can be very different. One of the most influential findings of the psychometric approach concerns what Paul Slovic and his colleagues called the dread dimension of risk. When researchers asked participants to evaluate dozens of hazards on characteristics such as controllability, catastrophic potential, severity of consequences, and fairness, they found that many of these ratings were strongly related to each other. In other words, hazards that were seen as catastrophic also tended to be viewed as uncontrollable, potentially fatal, and unfairly distributed. These characteristics appeared to reflect an underlying psychological dimension that Slovic and his colleagues called dread. Examples of hazards that tend to score highly on this dimension include terrorist attacks, nuclear accidents, and major plane crashes. Many of these hazards are statistically rare, yet they often evoke disproportionately strong emotional reactions and are judged to be especially dangerous. Research suggests that hazards perceived as high in dread are often judged to be riskier and less acceptable than other hazards that pose similar or even greater statistical dangers. This does not mean that people's concerns about these hazards are irrational. Rather, it suggests that judgments of danger are influenced not only by the probabilities and the expected outcomes, but also by these characteristics, such as catastrophic potential, loss of control, and the possibility of severe consequences. As a result, catastrophic and uncontrollable events can be perceived as much more dangerous than their probability alone would suggest. When Slovic and his colleagues examined the broader pattern of people's ratings, they found that perceptions of risk were organized around more than one underlying dimension. In addition to dread, a second major dimension reflected the extent to which a hazard was perceived as known or unknown. This dimension is related to, but distinct from, familiarity. Familiarity, which we discussed earlier, refers to personal experience with a risk, whereas the known-unknown dimension reflects how well a hazard is understood scientifically, how observable its effects are, and the degree of uncertainty surrounding its consequences. In psychometric studies, hazards tended to be judged as more risky when they were perceived as difficult to observe directly, delayed in their effects, poorly understood by science, poorly understood by those exposed to them, or surrounded by substantial uncertainty. Consider the COVID-19 pandemic. Early in the pandemic, scientists knew relatively little about how the virus spread, how severe infections would be, who was most vulnerable, or what the long-term consequences might be. That uncertainty itself became an important part of how many people perceived the risk. This example illustrates a broader finding from risk perception research. People respond not only to what they know about a hazard, but also to what remains uncertain or unknown. From a psychological perspective, uncertainty is not merely a lack of information, it can become part of the risk itself. Of course, these psychological characteristics do not operate in isolation. People's perceptions of risk are influenced by familiarity, control, dread, uncertainty, and other factors simultaneously. Researchers have also found that when people evaluate a hazard, they rarely only think about its dangers. They also consider what they have to gain. This raises an important question. How do the perceived benefits of an activity or technology influence the judgments of risk? Research has consistently shown across many activities and technologies that perceived risks and perceived benefits tend to be negatively related. In other words, activities that people see as highly beneficial are often perceived as less risky, whereas activities viewed favorably are often perceived as more risky. This pattern suggests that people's judgments of risks and benefits are often psychologically linked rather than being entirely independent evaluations. Vaccines provide a useful illustration of this relationship. Individuals who view vaccines as highly beneficial for preventing disease often perceive them as relatively low risk, whereas individuals who hold more negative views of vaccines frequently perceive much greater risks. More generally, when people evaluate a hazard, they're often considering both its potential dangers and its potential benefits at the same time. In many cases, the same overall feelings about an activity or technology may shape both judgments simultaneously. Whether people decide to fly, accept a new technology, receive a vaccine, or support a particular public policy depends in part how they perceive risks and benefits. Because perceptions of risk shape how people respond to the world around them, they have important real-world consequences. These perceptions influence the choices that people make, the precautions they take, the policies they support, and the dangers they choose to ignore. Differences in risk perception also help explain why public reactions to hazards sometimes diverge from expert assessments that rely primarily on statistical evidence. Understanding risk perception therefore helps us understand not only how people think about danger, but also why decision-making under uncertainty can be so challenging. More broadly, the central insight of risk perception research is that judgments of danger are shaped by both statistical information and psychological meaning. Understanding risk therefore requires asking two related but distinct questions. What does the evidence suggest about the likelihood of harm? And what characteristics of this hazard make it feel dangerous? These two questions are often related, but they do not always lead to the same answer. Distinguishing between them is one of the central insights of the psychology of risk perception.